His truck was found at the edge of a remote overlook, still running. The driver's door open, his coffee still warm. But Jonah Raines' veteran park ranger was gone. No signs of a struggle, no tracks leading out. Just silence, and a final radio log scrawled at 4:42 a.m. Something watching me move. Now, months later, the forest is giving back pieces of a puzzle that no one wants to finish: blood-stained fabric, a compass that no longer points north, and whispers that don't belong to any living thing. Jonah didn't just disappear. He may have followed something that's been waiting in those woods for years. It began with the soft rumble of an idle engine, the kind of low, mechanical hum that feels too loud in a place made for silence. The sun hadn't crested the ridge yet, but the pale gray light of dawn was already spilling over the pines, brushing the gravel road with a dull shimmer. There, at the edge of a forest lookout no visitor ever really noticed, the truck Saturday parked, running, empty. It wasn't the first time someone had left a vehicle out past hours, but this was different. Before we go deeper into the disappearance of Jonah Raines, the trail that shouldn't exist, and the chilling evidence the forest never meant to reveal, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories that were never supposed to be found. Every click helps us bring light to the places long forgotten and to the people who still haven't come home. It's a small act, but it echoes louder than you think. Thank you. The driver's side door hung ajar. The overhead radio light glowed red, quietly blinking. Static filled the cab, not the kind that crackled with interference, but a deeper, almost empty sort of white noise. It sounded hollow, listless. Jonah Raines should have radioed in by now. Every ranger working the back routes of Black Hollow Reserve knew the protocol, especially Jonah. He was meticulous. The kind of man who would notice a snapped twig from a week ago, who logged bird migrations with more care than most people manage their taxes. He checked in every morning at 0600 without fail. Routine was religion in his line of work. Nature rewarded discipline. It punished everything else. When the morning dispatcher marked him overdue, it was first met with casual concern. "He's probably just out of range," someone said. "The North Ridge gets patchy after a storm." But there hadn't been a storm, not for 3 days. And Jonah never went off path without logging it first. By the time they sent a deputy out just to be sure, the sun had begun its crawl over the eastern canopy. The gravel crunched beneath tires as the cruiser pulled in beside Jonah's vehicle. His truck was still warm. The driver's seat was empty. His ranger's hat, creased and sun-faded, lay on the passenger floor. His thermos was still full, coffee gone cold. The road to the overlook was narrow, half-eaten by creeping roots and brush. It led to nowhere useful, just a craggy drop-off and a rusted guardrail that groaned in the wind. Tourists never came here. Rangers only did when they had a reason. Jonah hadn't logged any reason. No signs of struggle, no blood. No scuff marks leading into the trees. Just the faint smell of pine, gasoline, and something else, something metallic and stale, that lingered just beneath the surface of the wind. The kind of scent you notice without realizing. The kind that doesn't quite belong. His radio handset sat in its cradle, untouched. The last recorded transmission was from the evening before, mundane, unremarkable. North perimeter check completed. All quiet. That was it. No urgency, no warning. Just the calm cadence of a man doing his job. But the forest around the overlook wasn't calm. It felt still, too still. Not a bird call. Not a breeze. Even the insects had fallen silent. And in that suffocating quiet, something gnawed at the edges of reason. Jonah Raines had been here, and now he wasn't. People don't just vanish, not like this, not without a trace. But when the deputy walked the first few paces past the truck and into the tree line, his foot caught on something subtle. A shallow indent in the moss, a footprint, half erased by dew, just one, heading north, No return, no second step. Just forward, into the woods. Then nothing. The wind moves differently in Black Hollow after nightfall. It slides between the trees like something half awake, threading itself through the tall pines in breathy, uneven currents. Most nights, it's a harmless sound, the usual creaks and rustles of a living forest. But sometimes, when the air cools too fast and the sky presses too close, something else rides the breeze. Not quite a voice, not quite a bird, a whistle. Thin, distant, almost playful, and always out of place. The locals talk about it in low voices, usually after a few drinks. They don't call it a myth, and they don't call it real. It's just the pines. Something that happens sometimes. Something that's always happened. Some say it's the way the wind hits the hollowed-out trees, or the way sound bounces in the valleys. Others say it's just the woods remembering things. Either way, it doesn't bother them much. As long as you don't go out there after dark. Jonah Raines never put much stock in stories. He respected the forest, but he didn't romanticize it. To him, a ranger's job was about observation, not superstition. He cataloged weather patterns, tracked soil erosion, monitored animal activity. He believed in what could be measured, tagged, and recorded. If you asked him about the whistling, he'd shrug. "It's wind," he once said to a volunteer intern. "Always island." But 2 nights before he disappeared, he wrote something different. The entry was brief, wedged between a note about trail debris and a minor coyote sighting. His handwriting dipped slightly, like his hand had slowed. Whistling, not wind, that was all. No follow-up, no explanation. Just those 3 words, underlined once in red ink. He never used red ink. It stood out like blood on snow. That same night, campers in Sector 7 miles from Jonah's post reported hearing a strange sound near their site. One described it as a tune without rhythm, like someone whistling a song they didn't remember how to finish. Another said it sounded too close, as if it moved between the trees, circling them. When park authorities did a sweep the next morning, they found nothing disturbed. No tracks, no signs of wildlife. Just the campers wide-eyed, tired, eager to leave. Jonah was aware of the report. His initials marked the follow-up slip in the ranger logs, but he didn't write anything about it. No thoughts, no skepticism, no reassurance, just silence. Which wasn't like him. When they searched his cabin after he vanished, they found the logbook open on his desk. That entry, whistling, not wind, was the last he ever wrote. The pages after that were blank. But inside his desk drawer, folded into the creases of an old trail map, was something else. A slip of paper torn from a field guide. It listed bird calls of the Pacific Northwest. Barn owl, wood thrush, whippoorwill. Each had a description beside it. All were crossed out. Underneath, in Jonah's careful handwriting, was a single question. Who teaches the forest to whistle back? No one has answered it. Not yet. But sometimes, when the fog settles low and the trees hold their breath, the sound returns. A long, lilting whistle threading through the trunks too high for wind. Too human to be anything else. The radio logs are routine. Every ranger knows this. At the start and end of every patrol, during transitions between zones, and especially in the dark hours before dawn, when the forest shifts in strange and subtle ways, you check in. It's not just protocol, it's a tether. A thin wire of voice and static that ties you to the world beyond the tree line. Jonah Raines followed that protocol to the letter. For nearly 7 years, his reports came in like clockwork, measured, exact, often tinged with the weary rhythm of someone used to silence. But on the morning of his disappearance, the log breaks its rhythm. Time-stamped at 4:42 a.m. His final entry arrives through the dispatch system without warning. No preamble, no code. Just 4 words, rushed and clipped. Something watching me move. Then nothing. Dispatch assumed it was a misfire at first. Maybe his mic had stuck. Maybe he was trying to report a bear sighting or a trespasser. The phrasing was odd, vague, more emotional than Jonah typically allowed himself over the radio. Something watching me move. Not eyes spotted on me. Not bear at 90 meters. Something watching me move, like it had studied him. Like it was learning. The radio log shows no further entries. The line went silent. Attempts to reach him, first routine, then urgent, were met with open air, static. That soft, pulsing hum that fills the forest in the absence of answers. When the log was reviewed later, the dispatchers noticed something strange. In the seconds leading up to Jonah's final message, the audio background changed. Usually, the early morning logs carried the faint chorus of birds, waking, leaves brushing, distant insects. But this one had none of that. The sound behind his voice was hollow, compressed, almost like it had been recorded in a sealed space. And just before his words broke through, there's a noise barely perceptible unless you're listening for it. A single, high-pitched tone. Like feedback, but sharper. It lasts less than a second. Then Jonah's voice. Then nothing. Some say the words were a code, that Jonah was trying to say more than he could. Something watching me move. A warning, perhaps. A trigger phrase. Others believe he was simply afraid. Caught in a moment of realization, speaking without thinking. But anyone who knew Jonah knew he didn't panic easily. He was the one other rangers called when a hiker went missing or when a cougar was spotted too close to the paths. He was calm, grounded, logical, until he wasn't. His journal from the previous night had been uneventful. A note about a dead fox near the creek bed. A small erosion update near the south bend. Nothing about paranoia, nothing about being watched. But that's the thing about the forest, it doesn't warn you when it changes. They reviewed the tapes, sent them through audio filters, played them back at different speeds, looking for anything. A second voice, a crackle of movement. A whispered word layered beneath Jonah's own. But the silence that followed those 4 words was complete. Not even the wind spoke. And in that stillness, in that abrupt cessation of contact, something began to settle across the station. Not panic, not yet, but unease, the kind that spreads slowly, quietly, like something watching, like something moving. Jonah Raines lived most of his life in silence, not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that breathes with you. It surrounded him, followed him, fit him like a second skin. Out on the trails, in the backcountry, in the deep belly of the pines, where even the air moved slowly, that's where he was most himself. Not many people understood it, fewer still tried. But those who worked alongside him knew that Jonah wasn't hiding from the world. He had simply chosen a quieter version of it. He didn't fill space with talk, he filled it with presence. A kind of measured awareness that made him seem older than he was. His movements were patient. He'd kneel by a crushed fern just to confirm whether it was the print of a black bear or a heavy-footed hiker. He could tell if someone had passed by a day ago based on the pattern of pine needles disturbed underfoot. Time unfolded differently around him, slower, more deliberate. In town, people knew him by sight more than name. He'd show up at the same diner once a week, order black coffee and oatmeal, eat slowly, and tip in cash. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, his replies were short but not unkind. You got the feeling he was always listening to something else, the wind, maybe, or the memory of it. He'd never married, no children, no pets, just a truck, a trail kit, and a cabin tucked into the edge of Sector 3. It wasn't that he lacked connection, it's just that his connection was different. He spoke with trees, with the tracks left in mud, with the subtle movements of weather and light. His logs were meticulous, often annotated with side notes, observations about animal patterns, odd smells on the wind, unusually still mornings. Most rangers saw duty as a job. Jonah treated it like stewardship. And so, when he vanished, it wasn't just a man who went missing. It was certainty, predictability, routine. The kind of person you could set your watch by doesn't just disappear. That was the part no one could reconcile. Jonah didn't take risks. He knew the land like it was family. If something happened to him, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was something else. His boots were always laced, his maps always marked. He carried redundancies in his gear, 2 compasses, extra batteries, 3 ways to signal if stranded. He planned for failure, prepared for the unpredictable. And yet, on that final morning, something happened that he didn't see coming. Something that made him leave the engine running. Something that made him walk away without finishing his coffee, without calling for backup, without checking in. What kind of force unmoors a man like that? In the weeks that followed, some said he must have finally cracked. That years alone in the woods had unraveled something inside. But people who said that never really knew him. Jonah wasn't broken. He was deliberate. Whatever found him out there wasn't the result of human error. It was something that doesn't care how careful you are. And that's what makes it worse. When the reliable vanish, you stop trusting the ground beneath your feet. The silence he loved so much now stretches out behind him, longer and colder than ever, and no one knows what filled it after he stepped into the trees. The morning air still carried the bite of night when the search team fanned out from the overlook. Mist clung low to the forest floor, softening everything: edges of bark, outlines of footprints, the sound of boots pressing into damp earth. The truck still sat idling where Jonah had left it, a mute witness to whatever had followed, or led. The team started there. At first, the prints were clear. A series of measured, deliberate steps leading away from the gravel pull-off and into the tree line. Standard issue Ranger boots, size 11, confirmed. Jonah's. The gait was steady, no sign of stumbling, no evidence of panic. He had walked calmly, perhaps even cautiously. Not running, not chased, just moving forward. The brush thinned slightly as the path curved down into a shallow ravine. Here, the footprints pressed deeper, the ground more waterlogged. A perfect impression caught in the mud showed the sole clearly: every ridge, every worn groove. The searchers paused, took photos, casts. This wasn't a ghost they were tracking. This was real. Physical, still fresh. They followed the trail another 100 yards through undergrowth and a stand of birch trees, white trunks peeling like old paper. Then the prints began to change. Shallower, less defined. As if Jonah had started to move lighter. Or the ground had stopped holding him. At the base of a moss-covered ridge, the last print appeared, half of it, really pressed into a slick patch of fern and damp soil. One heel, then nothing. No more impressions, no scrape marks, no drag lines, no broken branches. The moss beyond was undisturbed, as though no one had stepped there. The ground was pristine, untouched. A line drawn in silence. The search team spread out, circling wide to see if the trail resumed elsewhere. It didn't. Cadaver dogs sniffed the air and whined, uneasy. One refused to move past the ridge. Another sat down abruptly, staring into the woods with ears flat against its skull. The handler couldn't explain it. Above the ridge, the forest opened briefly to a rocky outcropping: high ground, good visibility. But no signs of Jonah, no trail, no loose gravel, no indication of a fall or struggle. It was as if he had reached that last step and simply unspooled, unwound from the world. They searched for hours, grid by grid, radios crackling with clipped instructions and rising tension. But nothing else was found. No torn fabric, no gear, no blood, just that final footprint. A question carved into mud. By afternoon, the mist had burned off, and the forest looked ordinary again. Deceptively serene. Birds called overhead, insects returned. Later, when investigators reviewed the terrain data, they noted something strange. The moss beyond the ridge had an unnatural uniformity. No indentation, no compression, not even signs of small animal activity. As if something had pressed the reset button on a square of the earth. Jonah Raines had walked into that patch of forest, and then he had stopped existing in a way that made sense. Not lost, not taken, just gone. Cold tracks leading to nowhere, like a story that forgets how to end. Whisper Trail wasn't on any of the official park maps. It wasn't listed on trail apps, wasn't marked with signs, and didn't appear on the laminated charts handed out at the visitor center. To most, it didn't exist. But to the few who had wandered far enough, alone enough, for long enough, they knew better. It was real, just hidden, folded quietly into the deep woods, like a secret no one was supposed to find. The first person to mention it was an old hiker named Eli Wren, a wiry man with sunken eyes who used to haunt the ranger station in the off-season. He'd come in to refill water, check weather bulletins, and warm his hands by the stove. He spoke in riddles more than sentences, and walked with a limp he never explained. Most of the rangers humored him, let him talk, then sent him on his way. He once said, "Some trails whisper back when you walk too long alone." When asked what that meant, he only smiled and pointed toward the northeast boundary. "You'll know if you find it, but pray you don't." No one took him seriously. Most thought he was just another wilderness eccentric, worn thin by isolation and time. But Jonah listened. Not openly, not in front of the others, but later, when the fire had burned low and the chatter had faded, he would think about that phrase. Some trails whisper back. It unsettled him not because it sounded untrue, but because it didn't. Years later, after Jonah vanished, they searched his locker. Standard procedure. Most of what they found was expected. A spare uniform, extra socks, a weathered trail guide, a pair of neatly folded gloves. But tucked into the back wall, held in place with a strip of yellowed tape, was a folded note. On it, a single line written in black ink. "Don't go past Whisper Trail after dusk." There was no signature, no date. Just the warning, silent and solitary. That note didn't make sense to the investigators. There was no Whisper Trail on record. They assumed it was an inside joke or maybe a personal nickname for a remote path. But a few of the older rangers remembered hearing that name before spoken in passing by loners, late-night hikers, and the occasional lost backpacker who'd returned, different. One such account had surfaced 5 years earlier, buried in a forgotten incident report. A solo camper had stumbled into the ranger station at dawn, barefoot and trembling, unable to explain what had happened. His only clear sentence, "It kept calling me down the path, but the path kept moving." When asked where he had been, he pointed at the map to a dense cluster of trees northeast of the canyon basin. No trails marked there. Just raw woods. But on Jonah's personal map, found later inside his cabin, there was a faint line drawn in pencil through that same patch of forest. Unnamed, unlabeled, whisper thin. Something about that trail had captured Jonah's attention. Maybe it started as curiosity. Maybe it was something more. But it was clear he knew of its existence. And he knew to fear it. Or at least respect it. Enough to keep that note close, quiet, hidden. The warning wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't shout. It whispered. And that's what made it dangerous. Jonah Raines first noticed the change in her brother's eyes. Not a shift in color or brightness, but in focus, as if something behind them had quietly turned away. It wasn't dramatic. Jonah didn't call her with cryptic warnings or confess fears in the middle of the night. He was still Jonah, methodical, calm, soft-spoken. But something had gone dim inside him, like a lamp left burning in an empty room. She had visited him 3 weeks before he disappeared, bringing him a box of his favorite dried blueberries and a book. She thought he'd like poems about wilderness, solitude, the quiet violence of nature. He had smiled, thanked her, even brewed her coffee with the same battered percolator he'd used since college. But his smile didn't quite reach the surface. His movements were slower, his sentences shorter, like he was watching something just over her shoulder the entire time. He wasn't sad. Not in the traditional sense. There were no signs of depression, no slackness in his routines. If anything, he seemed more focused than usual, except not on her. Not on anything she could see. She asked him how the forest had been, and he answered in clipped, mechanical tones. Dry in the west. More scat near the ridge. Owl calls earlier than usual. Not the kind of things you say to fill space, but the kind you recite to avoid it. At one point, she asked if he was sleeping well. Jonah hesitated. Then he looked at her for a long moment and said, "It's louder out here than it used to be." When she asked what he meant, he just shook his head, as if it wasn't worth explaining or couldn't be. She didn't push. That wasn't their way. They were close, but not in the kind of way that involves spilling guts. They understood each other through glances, silences, shared routines. Jonah had always been drawn to stillness. As a boy, he'd sit on the porch for hours watching clouds shift across the tree line. He never wanted to live in cities. Too much noise. Too many people pretending not to be afraid of the dark. But this silence was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. When she hugged him goodbye, she felt the slight stiffness in his frame, the way he held on just a second too long, as though he was trying to remember the shape of her, as though he knew something he couldn't say. When the call came, when the Park Service told her that Jonah hadn't checked in, that his truck had been found empty and his trail gone cold, Maren didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not right away. She just stood still in her kitchen, hand frozen over the kettle, and whispered the only word that came to mind. Number. Not because she didn't believe it, but because a part of her had already known. In the days that followed, she gave interviews. Spoke to rangers, detectives, reporters. Told them he was reliable. Said he wouldn't just vanish. But the phrase she returned to again and again, the one she finally wrote down in her own journal, was this: he was already disappearing before he disappeared. Like something had reached across the line between worlds and tugged gently, so gently at first, until he began to slip. Not afraid, not broken, just somewhere else. They found the map inside a drawer at Jonah's cabin, beneath a stack of field notes and folded flannel shirts. At first glance, it looked like any standard issue, topographical chart of Black Hollow Reserve, laminated, creased from frequent use, corners curled slightly from wear. Every ranger carried one. It was their blueprint, their compass, their language. But this one was different. This one had been marked. A single route, long and winding, had been circled in red ink. The line was faint in some places, like it had been traced more than once, corrected, adjusted. But it was deliberate. It started just east of the overlook, where Jonah's truck had been found, and twisted deep into the densest section of the forest, an area officially designated as undeveloped terrain. There were no trails there, no names, no markers. Just trees, rock, and wilderness left untouched by boots or blades. The park's master documents showed nothing in that region. No history of footpaths, no logging roads, no native land trails. No reason, really, for a ranger to go there, except maybe to note erosion or check fire risk. But Jonah's map seemed to tell another story. This path wasn't a casual sketch. It was studied, traced, lived in. Someone had walked it more than once, possibly Jonah himself. The red ink matched the pen kept in his ranger log, the same kind used to underline whistling, not wind. And when investigators flipped the map over, they found small pencil notations along the route. Time stamps, single-word entries, stillness, low tone, stone cairn, echo. These weren't notes meant for others, they were breadcrumbs, left for himself, or someone else. The terrain it cut through was known for being difficult, dense underbrush, steep ridges, sudden drops into dry ravines. It wasn't the kind of place you explored casually, not without gear and planning. And Jonah had neither when he disappeared. No pack, no food, not even his secondary flashlight. That suggested he either hadn't planned to go far, or he didn't intend to go at all. But the map hinted otherwise. A few old-timers on the search team remembered stories from decades ago, fragments of conversation, warnings passed between rangers over coffee. There'd been talk, long ago, of a forgotten footpath. Not a man-made trail, but something older. A path that seemed to shift when followed, where distance folded in unnatural ways. No one had ever proven its existence, and most dismissed it as campfire fiction. But Jonah had found something, or believed he had. Why he didn't report it is harder to answer. Rangers are trained to log any irregularities, especially undocumented trails. But Jonah had kept this one quiet. No mention in his official reports, no GPS tags. Just this private chart, hidden in the quiet order of his things, as though the knowledge itself were fragile. Maps are meant to orient, to ground, but this one asked questions instead of answering them. Why was the path real to him but invisible to everyone else? What had he seen that made him return, again and again, to a route no one else could find? There's a difference between getting lost and seeking something. Jonah Raines hadn't wandered off course. He had followed a path, one he knew, and no one else did, one that didn't belong on any map except his. They found the compass 2 days after the official search had ended, when the volunteers, locals, mostly kept combing the area in small, silent groups, unwilling to accept that Jonah had simply disappeared into the trees. It was lying just beyond the tree line, nestled in a bed of moss like it had been placed there gently, intentionally, rather than dropped in a moment of panic. The brass casing was pitted with rust, the face smudged with dirt and sap, but the needle was still visible beneath the cracked glass. It was no longer spinning, it was frozen, and it wasn't pointing north. The compass had been a gift from Jonah's father, given to him when he was 16, and had just finished his first solo backpacking trip. Marin remembered the story well. Their father had stood at the edge of the trailhead, arms crossed, a rare smile creasing his weathered face as Jonah stepped out of the woods, dirt-streaked and sunburnt but proud. The compass had been wrapped in an old cloth handkerchief and tied with string. "A man should know where he stands," their father had said, and how to find his way back. Jonah had treasured it. He carried it through college, through ranger training, through every long patrol across the reserve. It had been more than a tool, it was a reminder. A weight in his pocket that told him the world still made sense. That no matter how thick the fog or how strange the woods, there was always a direction that was true, until now. When the search team logged the compass, they noted its orientation. The needle was locked, not due north, but southeast, angled sharply toward a stretch of land that had already been cleared multiple times. No tracks, no signs, just trees and more trees. As if the compass had found a truth that didn't align with magnetic fields. Some dismissed it as a mechanical failure. After all, the compass was old, exposed to the elements, likely damaged from years of use. But that didn't explain the stillness of the needle. It didn't shake, didn't waver. It simply pointed, like it had made up its mind. And in a strange way, it mirrored Jonah's final days. Quiet, focused, pulled toward something invisible. Marin was the one who confirmed it was his. She recognized the initials carved into the underside, JR, shaky, uneven, carved with a penknife when Jonah was still a boy. Holding it in her hands, she said it felt wrong. Not just because it was broken, but because it felt emptied, like something essential had been drawn out of it. As if the compass hadn't just failed, it had been silenced. They tested it again later, back at the station. Held it against known magnetic lines, ran it beside other compasses. The needle never moved. It stayed fixed, unwavering, pointing not to magnetic north, but to something else, something buried, something calling. In the end, they sealed it in an evidence bag, labeled it with a date and time, and locked it in a drawer with the other fragments of Jonah's last known hours. But even now, some say if you take it out near the ridge and lay it flat on your palm, the needle quivers. Just slightly, like it remembers, like it still wants to go home. It was nearly a month after Jonah vanished when the board was discovered. The ranger station had been combed more than once by officers, by colleagues, by those still hoping for something that would make sense of what had happened. But it wasn't until a junior maintenance worker was fixing a warped shelf in Jonah's former supply room that he noticed the edge of something odd. A gap in the back wall, slight but deliberate. When he pried it open, dust billowed out in a slow, choking puff. And behind the board was a shallow recess, cut crudely into the inner wall, handmade, hidden. A cache. Inside were 3 objects, arranged with quiet care. No labels, no explanation. Just fragments left like offerings or warnings. The first was an old cassette tape, housed in a clear plastic shell with no markings. The magnetic strip inside was slightly warped, as if exposed to heat, and the spools inside had stopped mid-turn, frozen in an unfinished thought. No one at the station had a player anymore, but the techs brought one in later that week. When they pressed play, the sound that spilled out was fractured and eerie, low-frequency hums, bursts of static, and beneath it all, something faintly rhythmic, not music, not voice. Something else. Like the sound of breathing filtered through leaves. Like a pattern trying to form but falling apart every few seconds. The second item was a small sketch folded down the middle, drawn on thick Ranger issue notepaper, yellowed and soft at the edges. The pencil lines were dense and smudged, as if the artist's hand had trembled or lingered too long in one place. The drawing depicted a pair of antlers, but not like any found on elk or deer. These were misshapen, asymmetrical, and at the tips of each prong, the lines flared out into shapes unmistakably human. Fingers, 5 per side. Jagged, jointed, reaching. Antlers shaped like hands. It was grotesque, surreal, and yet it felt deliberate, studied, like something remembered, not imagined. The final item was a torn page from a field journal standard issue, same kind Jonah had always carried in his breast pocket. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly water-damaged. Only one phrase remained, scrawled in uneven handwriting that didn't quite match Jonah's usual precision. They mimic. Just that. No punctuation, no context. But the words felt heavy, unfinished, like the end of a sentence that had been swallowed by something vast and waiting. Together, the 3 pieces didn't form a puzzle so much as a mood. A shadow of something that had followed Jonah maybe for weeks, maybe longer. None of these items had ever been logged in official reports. They didn't appear in his issued belongings, weren't part of any case file. They had been hidden, stowed away behind drywall, in a space meant never to be opened. That secrecy, more than anything, suggested fear. Not panic. Fear. Jonah had seen something. Not just the trees. Not just strange sounds on the wind. He had seen patterns, echoes, imitations. And he had left behind pieces of it, not to be found, perhaps, but to be kept safe, or buried. In the silence that followed the discovery, no one spoke aloud what most were thinking. If they mimic, what had been pretending to be part of this forest? What had Jonah been tracking? Or worse, what had been tracking him? They called it the widow tree long before anyone could remember why. It stood alone in a clearing near the edge of Sector 9. Its trunk bent unnaturally, like it had once tried to grow away from something but was forced to twist back. The bark was blackened near the base, not from fire, but from something older, some slow rot that hadn't spread to the trees around it. Even in daylight, the clearing felt wrong. Quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that pressed against your ears and made your own breath sound too loud. Most rangers passed it without comment. It was just a tree, they told themselves, albeit a strange one, but the campers knew it by name. Stories passed between tents and firelight. Warnings whispered to newcomers. Don't pitch near the widow tree. Don't stay too long after sunset. Don't listen if it calls. The Forest Service dismissed it all as folklore, regional superstition, nothing more. But the stories persisted. 2 weeks after Jonah vanished, a pair of campers from out of state, Emma Laird and her younger brother Colin, set up their tent just under a mile from the tree. They hadn't heard the stories. They'd only seen a nice flat spot with a decent view of the stars. That night, sometime after 1 in the morning, Emma woke to a sound she couldn't explain. Not wind, not an animal, something else. She described it later as screaming, but not from pain. It was too slow, too deliberate. As if something was practicing the sound of a scream, trying to stretch it into a shape that would pass as human. Not once, but over and over. Long, sharp bursts that faded into breathy gasps. The forest didn't echo it, it swallowed it. Colin didn't wake. Emma lay in her sleeping bag, heart pounding, phone clutched in one hand. She didn't move, didn't speak, but she recorded it. When they brought the audio to the ranger station the next day, no one knew what to say. The clip was short, 32 seconds, but what it captured was chilling. The sound started as a low, wet groan and grew in pitch until it reached something that resembled a human wail. But it was distorted, stretched, like it was coming through water or from behind something thick and old. There were no other noises, no rustling, no footsteps, just that scream, then silence. The recording was reviewed, passed to biologists. Some suggested it could be a fox, a mountain lion, even a bird. But none of the matches lined up. The cadence was wrong. The tone shifted too deliberately. It was as though the forest had taught itself what a scream sounded like, but only approximately. It was imitation without understanding. The audio never made it into the official report. The Forest Service labeled it inconclusive and warned the campers to avoid restricted areas. But in private, some of the rangers stopped walking past the widow tree alone. One began carrying a second flashlight, even during the day. Emma posted the sound online weeks later. Most assumed it was a hoax, audio manipulation, forest sound layered with screams. But a few listeners, those who had spent time in deep woods, said the same thing. It didn't sound like something trying to frighten you. It sounded like something trying to be you. Long before Jonah Raines vanished, before Whisper Trail became more than a rumor, and before antlered sketches began to surface in hidden walls, there was Henry Dawes. He had worked the same territory, Sector 9, the northern ridge, the remote overlooks choked with mist and pine. He wore the same uniform, followed the same routes, and vanished in much the same way. Quietly, without warning, leaving behind only questions that hardened into silence over time. It had been 15 years, long enough that most of the younger rangers didn't even recognize the name. Long enough that the official file was little more than a faded photograph, a weathered incident report, and a few yellowing clippings from the local newspaper. Search continues for missing ranger, the headline read. But the search hadn't lasted long. 2 weeks of boots on the ground, one aerial sweep, and a few cadaver dogs that refused to enter a stretch of woods near the basin. No body, no gear, just his truck, parked by the same overlook where Jonah's was later found, engine cold. Dawes had no family to press the issue, no one to demand answers, no media to push back. He became a name on a shelf, a lost ranger mourned briefly by colleagues, then slowly absorbed by the trees. But Jonah remembered him. And for reasons no one could explain, he had started digging. After Jonah's disappearance, Marin found a file tucked beneath the floorboards of his cabin. A manila folder filled with handwritten notes, photocopies, and grainy printouts. At the top was a name, Dawes, Henry. The notes were meticulous, obsessive. Jonah had traced patrol logs from 2008, matched them against modern maps, highlighted discrepancies in trail markers and water tables. He had marked a circle around the widow tree, long before the campers had ever recorded their scream. One page in Jonah's handwriting stood out. Dawes's last report, saw movement along unmarked trail. Sounded like someone calling my name. Echo didn't match terrain. There was no source listed. No confirmation. Just the quote, underlined twice, and a note below it. Echoes don't bend uphill. Jonah had even contacted retired rangers, requesting old shift schedules and debrief records. One had scribbled a reply on the back of a postcard. Dawes got weird near the end. Kept saying the trees were learning us. Then he just stopped showing up. It was clear Jonah hadn't shared any of this with his team. No one at the station knew he was researching a disappearance that had faded into myth. It wasn't part of any assignment. It wasn't required. So why had he done it? Some believe Jonah was looking for patterns. Some thread connecting his own strange sightings to something older. Others think he feared he was following in Dawes's footsteps, not metaphorically, but literally. That whatever had taken Dawes had begun to whisper to Jonah as well. The deeper question, the one that still lingers, is whether Jonah was trying to find the truth, or whether he was preparing to be found in the same way. Or not at all. It was a volunteer with a drone who first saw it. Someone unaffiliated with the official search. Just a quiet local with a decent camera and a nagging curiosity. He had flown the drone over the northern ridge dozens of times in the past week, hoping to spot something the others had missed: gear, footprints, maybe even Jonah himself. But what he found wasn't a person. It was a path. From the air, the forest looked like a tapestry of green and shadow, indistinct and tightly woven. Trails didn't often reveal themselves clearly unless they were worn down by years of human feet. But this one was different. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. A thin line slicing through the trees, barely disrupting the canopy, yet curving with an eerie precision. The volunteer recognized the shape immediately. He'd seen maps of Whisper Trail, Jonah's map, the hand-drawn one, marked in red. And this was it. Every curve, every bend, every strange angle. But reversed, as if the trail had been flipped like a photo negative. He showed the footage to the local sheriff first, who passed it along to the Park Service. When overlaid on Jonah's map, the mirrored path aligned perfectly in shape but not in position. The GPS coordinates didn't match any physical location where the original trail was thought to be. This new trail existed in a part of the reserve believed to be untouched. Terrain data showed no clearings, no signs of old logging roads or natural pathways. But the drone's camera didn't lie. Something had carved a pattern into the forest. Something that had gone unseen from the ground. The mirrored trail followed the same arc as Whisper Trail, but in reverse. Left bends became right. Descents turned into ascents. The topography made no sense. In several places, the mirrored version cut directly through sections of dense brush and rock formations that should have made passage impossible. And yet, the trail persisted, faint but deliberate, like a shadow following a body. Like an echo with its own voice. Rangers hiked to the coordinates. What they found was unsettling. No visible trail on the ground. No broken branches. No pressed earth. Just a subtle change in atmosphere. The air felt colder, even in daylight. Sound behaved oddly. Footsteps didn't echo. Birdsong faded faster. And in the center of it all, a stretch of pine that leaned slightly west, as though drawn toward something just out of reach. Some speculated that the drone footage was a glitch, a trick of light. Others believed it was evidence of a second trail system, older than the park itself, hidden by time or will. But a few, those who had reviewed Jonah's notes, those who had read the torn field page with "they mimic" scrawled across it, began to consider something else. That the trail wasn't a physical route at all. That it was a memory the forest kept and played back in reverse, as if mirroring not just the path, but the people who walked it. A copy laid over the original, never meant to be seen. The mirror trail didn't show up on satellite. Only drone footage revealed it. Only from a certain height. Only under specific light. As though it only wanted to be seen by those who already believed. And maybe that was the worst part. Jonah had followed something into the trees. Now it was showing its reflection. And it was waiting. It had been 19 days since Jonah Raines disappeared, when the search team stumbled upon the scrap of fabric. By then, most of the official resources had been pulled back. The story had faded from the front page. The posters stapled to bulletin boards were curling at the edges. People were starting to say things like, "probably lost," or "he didn't want to be found." But the forest had not yet given up everything it was holding. It was early morning when the discovery was made, cold light, filtering through high clouds, the ground still slick with dew. A team of volunteers, mostly locals who'd grown up around Black Hollow and knew its moods, were combing through an area that had been deemed unlikely. A sparse birch grove nearly 12 miles southeast of where Jonah's truck had been found. It wasn't near any known trails, wasn't aligned with the original search grids. The only reason they were there was because of a hunch. One man had noticed that birds seemed to avoid the area. He said the wind changed pitch there. The piece of fabric was caught on the low bark of a split birch tree, fluttering gently in the breeze. It was unmistakable greenish-gray, coarse, stitched with the patch of the National Park Service, part of a ranger's sleeve, torn ragged across the seam. But it wasn't the tear that made the volunteers stop moving. It was the dark bloom of red staining the center of the fabric. Not brown with age, not dried into obscurity, still red, still recent. They sent it in for testing, though no one doubted whose it was. A few days later, the confirmation came back. Jonah's DNA. No doubt. The blood was his. But that raised a larger, darker question. How did it get there? The birch grove was more than a dozen miles from Jonah's last known position. He would have had to cross 2 ridgelines, a dried riverbed, and at least one impassable thicket to reach it. No one believed he'd walked it, not without supplies, not without leaving more signs behind. And there were no tracks, no disturbed undergrowth, no signs of struggle. Just a single scrap of his uniform, hanging silently like a forgotten flag. The tear was unusual. Rangers and searchers alike noted that it wasn't clean, as though made by a blade or caught on a branch. It was frayed in a strange, uneven pattern, as though something had pulled at it slowly, deliberately, until the fibers gave way. One investigator noted it looked like it had been twisted, not ripped from a snag, but unwound. And then there was the tree. The birch it had been found on bore fresh gouges, low on its trunk, not deep enough to be from claws, too wide to be from tools. Some described them as resembling fingerprints, 5 parallel impressions like pressure points pressed into the bark. The wood had healed around them, as if it had happened just long enough ago for nature to start pretending it hadn't. Jonah's blood said he had been there. The silence of the grove said something else had too. And in the stillness that followed the find, every member of the search team felt the same thing. Not relief. Not closure. Just the certainty that whatever had touched Jonah was still walking among the trees, and still knew how to stay 12 miles ahead. The shaft wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't marked on any geological survey, any park documentation, or in the memory of even the oldest rangers. It had been swallowed long ago by brush and time, a sunken wound in the side of the forest floor, hidden beneath a web of ferns and rot. The dogs found it first, 2 cadaver dogs from out of state, brought in by a private organization after official search efforts had waned and public interest dulled to a low hum of speculation and forgotten flyers. They had been quiet most of the day, sniffing through the usual deadfall and overgrown thickets with mechanical precision. But then, as the team rounded a low ridge near the southeast basin, both dogs froze in place. Their hackles rose in unison, bodies rigid. Then came the whimpering. Not the kind of alert handlers expected, not the anxious, excited response of a scent found, but something deeper. Fear, maybe. Refusal. One of them pulled violently against the leash, trying to back away. The other dropped to its stomach, growling low and constant, ears flat. No one moved for a moment. Then one of the handlers spotted it, a dip in the earth, a blackness that didn't belong among the moss. When they cleared away the debris, they found the opening. Narrow, jagged, lined with half-collapsed timber and old stone. A forgotten mine shaft, unrecorded, unspoken. They debated descending. It wasn't stable, wasn't safe. But the dogs refused to approach again, and something in the silence of the place made standing on the surface feel worse than climbing down. The first responder to enter described the air as thick, like walking into water, though the temperature hadn't changed. Every footstep echoed, but not in the right direction. Sounds bounced oddly, felt delayed. It was only 10 feet deep before the shaft leveled into a cramped, horizontal crawl space, probably a ventilation passage from a forgotten operation long since buried by time. The flashlight beams swept over dirt and stone, rusted beams, a few broken bottles, nothing out of place. Until they found the boot. It was lying on its side in a shallow bed of dust, perfectly preserved, as if someone had set it there. Left foot, standard park ranger issue, faded green, worn at the heel. When they checked the tread pattern, it matched the prints left behind near Jonah's abandoned truck, size 11, his. There was no blood, no foot inside, no signs of struggle. Just the boot, alone in the dark, as though it had walked there on its own and decided not to leave. The team searched the shaft thoroughly, no other personal effects, no body, no trace of who or what might have dragged or placed the boot there. When they brought it back up, the dogs refused to go near it. One vomited on the edge of the clearing. The other cowered behind its handler, trembling. Later, when geologists reviewed aerial data, they concluded there should be no mines in that area. The rock was wrong, the location too remote. No history of excavation, no reason for a shaft to exist. And yet it had been there, waiting. Some say the forest buries what it wants forgotten. Others believe it remembers too much. And beneath the silence of roots and stone, something had once opened its mouth wide enough for a man to step inside. Only one boot came back. The cassette tape sat in the evidence locker for weeks before anyone could play it. Dust-coated, unlabeled, almost brittle with age, it had been tucked away behind the false wall in Jonah's locker, next to the sketch of the hand antlers and the torn page that read, "They mimic." No one knew how long it had been there. It could have predated his disappearance by days or months. There was no date, no markings. Just a strip of magnetic tape coiled in silence, waiting to speak again. The first attempt to play it failed. The old player chewed the tape halfway through, garbling the already warped audio. It was sent to a forensic lab with restoration capabilities, where the hiss and static were slowly peeled back layer by layer. The resulting audio was not clean. It didn't tell a story. It didn't offer an answer. But it gave something far worse. Fragments of sound that hinted at what Jonah had been hearing and fearing before he vanished. The restored file begins with a long stretch of white noise, wind, perhaps, or static from the recorder. Then, faintly, a rhythm. Not speech, not machinery. Footsteps. Soft, irregular, moving across leaves and damp soil. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Then breathing. Ragged, close to the mic, as though the recorder had been held against Jonah's chest or tucked inside a pocket while he moved. There's no narration, no log entry. Jonah doesn't introduce the recording or explain what he's doing. The tape simply starts in motion, as if he knew what might happen and wanted it captured, not for evidence, but for memory. Several minutes pass in near silence. Then, suddenly, a shift. The footsteps stop, the breathing becomes sharper, more deliberate, a faint rustle. And then, another set of steps. Not overlapping, not in sync. The second set is quieter, as though moving at a distance but mirroring the first. When Jonah pauses, the second pair pauses. When he moves again, they follow. It continues like that, an eerie call and response with no caller, no responder, just two sets of motion trying to inhabit the same space. Then, at minute 6, a whisper, barely audible, distorted by static, repeated twice. It's not alone. The voice is unmistakably Jonah's. Hoarse, quiet, not panicked but resolved, like a man confirming something he already suspected. There's a pause. The breathing stops altogether. Then the sound cuts abruptly, not like the tape ended, but like it was interrupted. Severed mid-thought, the rest is silence. Audio experts combed the file for more clues: background frequencies, directional noise, even subsonic elements. One engineer, unofficially, said it sounded like there were more than two presences moving, as if something beneath the threshold of human hearing had been layered into the forest itself. Others dismissed it as degradation. Tape rot, psychological projection. But those who had walked the whisper trail, the few who had followed the mirrored paths, who had stood by the widow tree and felt the ground hold its breath, heard something else. They recognized the pacing, the strange silence, the mimicry. The same feeling that something, somewhere, was learning the shape of a human presence and trying to wear it. Jonah didn't scream. He didn't run. He didn't beg for help. He whispered a warning, tucked it inside a cassette, and left it for someone to find. It's not alone. Long before Jonah vanished, long before his truck was found idling at the overlook, and his name began circulating in whispers, something inside him had already begun unraveling quietly, deliberately, like the thread of a story being tugged from the center. It didn't begin with a scream in the forest or a trail gone cold. It began with questions. Notes scribbled in the margins of official reports, strange sketches on napkins, books left open to pages about mimicry, folklore, and things that don't belong in modern daylight. He started asking about the old ranger Henry Dawes months before anyone realized. There were no official orders to reopen the case, no prompt from superiors, but Jonah had combed through incident logs, scanned archived newspapers, even reached out to a retired dispatcher who once handled Dawes's final calls. He collected information like a man collecting pieces of himself, bits that might explain something he couldn't quite say aloud. Marin remembered the shift. Not sudden, just subtle things, a growing impatience when she asked about work, the way he'd drift off during conversations, staring into the woods like they were speaking back to him. He began carrying an old analog recorder, even though the department had long moved to digital logs. He said it picked up things the others missed. When she asked what kind of things, he didn't answer. Jonah's cabin reflected the descent. Field journals arranged, not by date, but by symbol, strange shapes drawn into the corners of each cover, some resembling antlers, others like distorted handprints. On the walls, pinned between maps and aerial photographs, were pages torn from obscure ethnographies, local legends passed down without documentation. One phrase repeated often: "The forest remembers what it consumes." He had marked his own map with more than trails. Small red circles denoted locations where hikers reported whispers, where animals were found mutilated but not eaten, where the wind carried voices that didn't echo properly. To anyone else, it looked like paranoia. But Jonah was systematic, methodical. He wasn't unraveling. He was searching, hunting maybe, or preparing. One flashback, pulled from a recorded conversation with another ranger weeks before the disappearance, hints at his state of mind. "What if it doesn't take you all at once?" he'd said. "What if it just waits? until you forget who you were outside of the trees. In another, a colleague recalls Jonah returning from patrol pale and silent. He had stood at the edge of the trailhead, staring into the distance. It was copying the bird calls, he'd muttered. But it didn't know when to stop. The deeper he went, the more he withdrew. His logs became fragmented, less observational and more introspective. Lines like, echoes arriving before the sound, and, saw my own tracks today, but I hadn't walked there yet. Were these metaphors, or memories? The final entries in his private journal were almost illegible, written with a trembling hand. One page bore a single sentence repeated over and over. It's wearing someone. Another, a diagram that looked like a trail looping back into itself endlessly, with one word scrawled in the center, mirror. Jonah Raines was no longer just a ranger in those final days. He had crossed into something else, a kind of witness, a kind of sacrifice. Maybe he believed that if he went far enough in, if he understood it, mapped it, confronted it, he could stop what had happened to Dawes. Maybe he thought he could stop it from happening again. But whatever he was chasing, or fleeing from, was older than the trail, deeper than the roots. And when the forest called, he didn't run. He followed. The hikers weren't looking for anything. That's what made the discovery feel worse somehow. They weren't ghost hunters or thrill seekers chasing local legends. Just two friends on a backcountry loop, chasing the last warmth of late autumn before the snow settled in for good. They had veered off the designated trail by accident, misreading a worn blaze, and ended up deeper into the woods than they had planned. The air felt different there, thicker, quieter. The trees older, as if they'd been watching longer. That's when they saw the stones. A cairn, if you could even call it that. Not the neatly stacked kind used by trail builders to mark safe passage. This one was primitive, hunched like a broken spine, its stones moss-covered and uneven. No more than a foot high. It looked like it hadn't been made by hands used to shaping anything. Just stacked clumsily, desperately by someone trying to mark a spot in a place that didn't want to be remembered. Curiosity drew them closer. There was no sign of animal activity nearby, no prints, no scent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. They took the top stone off slowly, expecting to find a note, a forgotten compass, maybe nothing at all. Instead, they found the badge. Faded, scratched, still pinned to the strip of torn uniform fabric it had once been fastened to. The words, National Park Service, barely visible beneath a smear of dirt and time. But the name was unmistakable, even beneath the grime, J. Raines. They didn't touch anything else at first. Just stood there, the world around them suddenly too still. Then one of them spotted the corner of paper, folded, wedged between two stones at the base. It took effort to pull free. The fibers had swollen from damp and years, but the ink remained bold, scrawled in familiar handwriting, tight and slanted. A single sentence. I'm part of the woods now. No date, no explanation, nothing to place it, but it was enough. They turned back immediately, cutting their hike short, retracing their path through terrain that seemed subtly different on the return, like the trees had leaned in while they weren't looking. The ranger station was quiet when they arrived, nearly closed for the season. They placed the badge on the counter and left without waiting for questions. When the authorities returned to the site with GPS and ground-penetrating radar, the cairn was still there, but the page had already begun to dissolve. Moisture had blurred the ink into bleeding veins. No body was found. No bones. No signs of burial or struggle. Just the badge. Just the words. Just that strange ring of silence where even the birds refused to sing. Some said it was a message, a goodbye. Others claimed it was a trap, something left behind not by Jonah, but by whatever had learned to wear his voice, his thoughts, his footsteps. But no one could say for sure. The badge was placed in a glass case, displayed at the ranger station beside a plaque that offered no explanation, just his name and the dates of service. No end date, no closure, just a pause. But those who hiked far enough, deep enough, sometimes came back speaking of a place where the trees seemed to recognize them. Where echoes didn't follow but led. And where, just for a moment, they thought they saw someone ahead on the path. Not walking, not running, just waiting.